September 1943. The Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's successor studied the American advance across the Pacific with a calculation born of mathematical certainty. The Japanese High Command had positioned their fortresses on every significant atoll, every jungle-clad island, creating a defensive perimeter they believed impenetrable. The distances were immense, thousands of miles of ocean separating the American homeland from the Japanese defensive line. Surely American logistical doctrine would crumble under the weight of those distances. Surely the Americans would need to capture and hold every island, consolidating their position methodically before advancing to the next objective. The traditional rules of warfare dictated this. No army could sustain its supply lines over such oceanic gulfs while maintaining fighting strength. The Americans, one Japanese strategic analyst declared, lack the industrial capacity to maintain operations across such impossible distances. They will bog down. Their supplies will be eaten by the sea. Attrition will be our victory. This confidence, rooted in the logic of every previous war, was about to encounter something history had never witnessed before. Not desperation born of need, but abundance born of industrial supremacy. But what the Japanese strategists could not have foreseen was the awakening of American productive might. While they calculated logistics through the lens of scarcity, counting every shell and gallon of fuel with the precision of men managing penury, the United States was already manufacturing the means of total war on a scale that transcended all previous human experience. Island hopping was not a strategy born from brilliance in planning. It was a strategy born from industrial omnipotence. It was the weaponization of abundance, the transformation of logistical capability into doctrine itself. In the Pacific theater, American ingenuity would prove that distance was irrelevant to those with unlimited resources, and the doctrine of bypassing enemy strongholds would become the very instrument of Japan's annihilation. The mathematics of defeat was already being written on factory floors across the American heartland, and the Japanese could not read it. In 1943, the United States produced 19.4 million tons of shipping. Japan, with all its territorial acquisitions and desperate mobilization, managed to construct and maintain approximately 900,000 tons of merchant shipping, a fraction so small that it barely registers as a percentage of American capacity. Yet these numbers represented only the beginning of the disparity. American shipyards launched 3,000 Liberty ships during the war, each one carrying 10,000 tons of cargo across the vastness of the Pacific. The Japanese possessed no equivalent construction capacity, no means to replace their vessels as they were sunk by American submarines and naval aircraft. The mathematics was not merely imbalanced, it was apocalyptic in its finality. The logic of industrial warfare was inescapable. The side with unlimited supply lines would win. In 1944, the year island hopping reached its crescendo. American productive capacity reached its zenith. The United States manufactured 96,000 aircraft, 24,000 tanks, and 2.6 million small arms. The ammunition production alone, 3.4 million tons across all categories, represented a scale that previous warfare had never contemplated. Ships sailed from San Francisco, Seattle, and Los Angeles, laden with supplies calculated not in terms of survival, but in terms of overwhelming superiority. Total naval shipments to the Pacific in 1944 alone reached 5,822,000 tons. This was not the provisioning of an army operating within constraints. This was the manifestation of industrial abundance transformed into military doctrine. The contrast between the two empires was stark, almost surreal in its asymmetry. The German Wehrmacht and the Japanese military operated on the principle of material conservation. Every vehicle carefully maintained, every shell accounted for, every gallon of fuel a calculation between competing necessities. The American military, conversely, operated on the principle of wasteful abundance. If a truck broke down, it was abandoned rather than repaired. If a supply cache needed to be destroyed to prevent its capture, it was destroyed. Machine guns were maintained through replacement rather than repair. The Americans could afford to think in terms of disposability. The Japanese, forced to operate in an environment of scarcity despite their territorial holdings, could not afford any waste whatsoever. The Japanese soldier counted his rations. The American soldier left half-eaten meals on tables. By 1944, American supply lines had become so sophisticated, so redundant, and so overwhelming that the entire Pacific campaign was fundamentally rewritten. Forward operating bases were established with such frequency and such abundance of material that the old rules of warfare, the rules that said you must hold every position, that you cannot leave enemies in your rear, that supply lines must never extend beyond the capacity to sustain them, became quaint anachronisms. Island hopping did not violate these rules through clever tactics. It violated them through the sheer overwhelming reality of American industrial power. The machinery of American logistics had developed into something almost organic, a living system of supply that seemed to anticipate need before it manifested. Consider the simple matter of fuel. In 1944, American forces in the Pacific required approximately 50 million gallons of fuel daily across all operations. The U.S. Navy ran dedicated fleet trains of tanker ships that moved with the fighting forces like enormous floating supply depots. The Japanese Navy, faced with similar operational needs, operated under perpetual fuel crisis. Their destroyers and cruisers conducted operations knowing that fuel reserves might determine not victory, but mere survival. American naval commanders, by contrast, conducted operations with the casual certainty that fuel was essentially infinite. When strategic bombing campaigns required the destruction of fuel dumps to prevent their capture, American commanders authorized the destruction of millions of gallons without hesitation. To the Japanese observer, this was incomprehensible waste. To the American planner, it was simply prudence, the cost of ensuring that captured supplies could not sustain the enemy. The human element of this logistical machinery deserves attention. On Guadalcanal in late 1942, American Marines subsisted on captured Japanese rations, a desperate measure necessitated by the breakdown of supply lines that stretched 50% longer than the Japanese equivalent distance from their nearest advance base. The symbolism was profound. American warriors, representatives of the world's greatest industrial power, reduced to eating the rations of a defeated enemy because the machinery of supply had not yet learned to operate across oceanic distances on the necessary scale. But Guadalcanal represented the failure state, the moment before adaptation. By 1943, supply requirements had been standardized. In 1944, the Pacific Theater had stabilized into something approaching logistical perfection. A serviceman in the Pacific required 67.4 pounds of supplies per day: weapons, ammunition, food, medical supplies, clothing, construction materials. This standard was met with such regularity, such methodical precision, that American forces never again faced the deprivation that characterized the early island campaigns. The supply calculation itself was extraordinary. For every pound of ammunition required, 1.5 pounds of supporting supplies were needed: fuses, primers, casings, packaging. Construction materials averaged 11.9 pounds per man per day, necessary for building airstrips, fortifications, storage facilities, and the infrastructure that transformed captured islands into forward operating bases. The American military in the Pacific did not merely occupy islands, it industrialized them. Coral atolls that had existed in their natural state for millennia were transformed within weeks into functioning military establishments, complete with power generation, fresh water production, ammunition bunkers, fuel depots, and hospital facilities. The machinery of logistics made this transformation possible. The machinery of scarcity, which governed every other fighting force on Earth, made it impossible for any opponent. The specific case of the Central Pacific Campaign illuminates the transformation. In November 1943, American forces attacked the Gilbert Islands, beginning the northwestward drive across the Central Pacific toward Japan. The campaign was meticulously planned through logistics, not through tactics. The supply requirements for a Marine division landing on a defended atoll were enormous. Each Marine required approximately 20 pounds of equipment on his person, plus another 2,000 pounds of support supplies distributed across the landing fleet: ammunition, food, medical supplies, beach landing equipment, fuel, Vehicles. For a single Marine division of 15,000 men, this represented 30,000 tons of material. The transport ships, cargo ships, tankers, and specialized landing craft needed to deliver this material had to be choreographed with the precision of a symphony. A single broken-down vehicle in a port could cascade through the entire schedule, delaying operations. The American military overcame this challenge through redundancy. If one transport ship was damaged, another was immediately dispatched. If one cargo dock was overwhelmed, another was activated. The system had sufficient abundance to compensate for inefficiencies that would have crippled any other military organization. By early 1944, the logistical apparatus had matured into something that transcended mere supply. Married support, the concept of attaching supply and support personnel to combat formations, meant that American forces advanced not with a vulnerable tail of supply lines but with organic supply integrated directly into their operational structure. Navy supply squadrons moved with the fleet, carrying ammunition, fuel, food, and spare parts. These floating depots were themselves supplied by an oceanic supply train stretching back across thousands of miles to the American mainland. The destroyer escort, USS Baffin, a supply-class vessel, could transfer supplies to other vessels while underway, maintaining operational tempo without requiring expensive anchorage time or vulnerability at fixed ports. The Japanese possessed no equivalent capability. Their naval forces, required to maintain operations across equally vast distances, could only refuel at fixed anchorages, rendering them vulnerable to air attack and creating tactical opportunities for American forces. The invasion of the Marianas in June 1944 represented the crescendo of this logistical revolution. The campaign required transporting approximately 2 million men, 340,000 tons of equipment, and all supporting supplies across the Western Pacific, a distance exceeding 3,000 miles from the nearest American base. The task would have seemed impossible to any previous military commander. Yet the United States executed it with such mechanical precision that operations proceeded ahead of schedule rather than behind it. Admiral Chester Nimitz's forces captured Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, not through tactical brilliance, though that existed in abundance, but through logistical overwhelm. The Japanese garrison on Saipan could muster approximately 30,000 combat troops. American assault forces landed with 70,000 men in the first wave alone, with reinforcements totaling 300,000 before the operation concluded. The disparity was impossible to overcome. American forces had achieved what had previously been impossible: numerical superiority across an oceanic gulf at a distance of thousands of miles from their homeland. The case of Iwo Jima provides a specific window into the mechanics of this logistical triumph. The invasion in February 1945 required landing 75,000 combat troops on a volcanic island only 8 square miles in area. The Japanese garrison numbered approximately 21,000. The supply requirement for American forces alone during the landing phase was staggering: 1,400 tons of supplies per day for the first week of combat, expanding to 2,500 tons daily as operations continued. Ships had to deliver food, ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements in such volume that they formed a continuous queue. The 5th Marine Division, which bore the heaviest casualties, was supported by supply lines that never wavered. When medics ran low on blood plasma or antibiotics, replacements arrived by high-speed transport aircraft. When ammunition grew low, ammunition ships moved through the logistical network to ensure replenishment. The American military had achieved something unprecedented: the industrialization of warfare itself. The submarine menace to American supply lines, theoretically catastrophic, had been largely neutralized by 1944. American destroyers and destroyer escorts provided constant anti-submarine protection to the supply convoys. When submarines managed to penetrate the protective screen and sink a cargo vessel, replacements were already dispatched from American ports. The Japanese, conversely, faced a submarine threat of exponentially greater magnitude. American submarines sank cargo vessels carrying irreplaceable supplies, not because Japanese supply security was negligent, but because American submarine forces were so numerous and so effectively supplied that opposition was mathematically impossible. In 1944, American submarines sank 3.3 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping. The Japanese could replace perhaps 200,000 tons of this capacity through new construction. The mathematics were murder. The specific evolution of amphibious doctrine under logistical pressure is instructive. Early amphibious operations, particularly the invasion of Guadalcanal in August 1942, were executed with minimal logistics consideration. Marines landed with supplies expected to last only a few days, with reinforcement convoys to follow. When Japanese naval forces disrupted these reinforcement operations, American forces on Guadalcanal faced desperate deprivation. The lesson was painful but definitive. Amphibious operations could not succeed without logistical planning integrated from the beginning. By 1944, American amphibious doctrine had transformed. Each landing operation was planned backward from logistics, first calculating the supply requirement, then determining how many assault troops could be supported, then planning tactical operations within those constraints. The Marshall's Campaign in January 1944, the Marianas Campaign in June, the Palau Campaign in September, and the Iwo Jima Campaign in February 1945 all represented progressively more sophisticated applications of this logistically derived doctrine. The nature of the support for these campaigns reveals the scale of American industrial production. During the Marianas operation, American forces launched 2,500 tons of supplies per day. During Iwo Jima, this expanded to 3,000 tons daily. At Okinawa, the final major campaign in April 1945, logistical requirements reached 4,000 tons per day. Yet supply shortages, the kind that had crippled previous operations, became theoretical concerns rather than operational realities. When airbases needed to be constructed on newly captured islands, heavy construction equipment arrived by ship. When these airbases began operations, fuel arrived in such volume that fighters could operate from dawn to dusk with no conservation measures. The American military achieved what no other military organization in history had achieved: the industrialization of consumption itself. The Japanese response to this avalanche was panic dressed in strategy. Japanese strategists, observing the inexorable advance westward, attempted to calculate where American forces would strike next, then concentrated their defenses accordingly. The calculation proved futile. American logistical capacity allowed for simultaneous operations against multiple objectives. While Japanese forces prepared defensive positions on islands they believed would be attacked, American forces attacked different islands. By the time Japanese reserves could be repositioned, American forces had already consolidated their position and established supply lines for the next offensive thrust. The enemy's ability to concentrate force, the traditional advantage of the defender, was negated by American logistical flexibility. There was a moment, precise, documented, and devastating, when the realization crystallized in the minds of Japanese military leadership. It occurred not in a sudden military defeat, though those were accumulating with increasing rapidity. It occurred in the confrontation with American waste. In March 1945, interrogators of Japanese prisoners questioned a captured naval officer regarding American supply practices. The prisoner reported that American forces routinely abandoned undamaged vehicles rather than repair them, that half-eaten meals were disposed of rather than rationed, that fuel was burned to deny it to Japanese forces rather than conserved. The interrogator, American, initially believed the prisoner was fabricating these statements to confuse him. Surely no nation, no matter how productive, would consciously waste material on such a scale. Yet the interrogator eventually came to realize the prisoner was reporting truth so extraordinary that it transcended conventional military calculation. Japanese military doctrine, refined across centuries of samurai tradition and sharpened by the necessities of a resource-poor island nation, operated on principles of conservation and efficiency. A Japanese soldier was expected to make do with less. A Japanese officer was expected to accomplish more with fewer resources. The entire strategic culture of Japan was rooted in the principle that material scarcity was a constant, that victory came through superior will, discipline, and tactical skill compensating for material disadvantage. The confrontation with an enemy that operated on precisely opposite principles shattered this worldview at its foundations. American abundance was not a temporary advantage that discipline and determination could overcome. American abundance was systemic, structural, and potentially infinite. The mathematics of depletion, the principle that every resource consumed by the defender brought them closer to defeat, applied only to one side. A senior Japanese officer reflecting on American supply operations in a post-war interrogation stated with almost philosophical resignation, "We were fighting a nation that could replace everything it lost, reinforce at will, and advance without logistical constraint. We were fighting industrial capacity itself." The outcome was determined not by tactical brilliance but by the fundamental economic disparity between two different industrial systems. The arrogance of Japanese strategic planning, that superior will could compensate for material disadvantage, collided with the reality that material disadvantage at this scale transcended all compensation. The realization transformed from intellectual understanding to metaphysical terror. The Japanese were not losing a war. They were being buried under an avalanche of industrial production. The final statistics of the Pacific War recorded not a military defeat, but an industrial annihilation. American forces sustained supply lines extending over 5,000 miles from the American mainland to the final assault positions against the Japanese home islands. At the height of operations in 1945, American forces in the Pacific consumed 4,000 tons of supplies per day at the combat front, with an additional 8,000 tons moving through intermediate supply depots and bases. The total throughput of American logistics in the Pacific theater in 1944 reached 5 million tons, sufficient to supply a field army of 2.5 million men with equipment, ammunition, fuel, food, and all supporting material indefinitely. Japanese forces, operating across similar distances with comparable numbers of troops, possessed perhaps 300,000 tons of supply capacity in their entire system, sufficient for weeks, not months, before deprivation would reduce combat effectiveness to symbolic gestures. The island hopping campaign was fundamentally a logistical strategy, masquerading as tactical doctrine. By selecting which islands to capture and which to isolate, American commanders were not exercising brilliant tactical judgment. They were exercising logistics optimization. An island left in Japanese possession but cut off from supply represented eliminated consumption of American logistical resources. An island that required capture was chosen for its logistical utility. Could it house an airbase? Could it provide anchorage for supply ships? Could it be consolidated into the supply network with acceptable overhead? The genius of island hopping in retrospect was not genius at all. It was merely the mechanistic application of logistical principle. In post-war interrogations, Japanese military leaders confronted the architecture of their defeat in statistical form. General Hideki Tojo, prime minister during the war, stated that American industrial production had been his greatest fear from the beginning of the war. "We could not defeat the United States in industrial war," he said. "We could only hope to defeat them militarily before their production advantage became decisive. We failed in that calculus." Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had expressed similar sentiments before his death in 1943. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." That resolve had been channeled entirely through logistical channels. The American giant awakened not with tactical brilliance but with assembly line production. Every ship launched from American shipyards represented one more ton of logistical capacity. Every aircraft manufactured represented additional air support for supply operations. Every ton of ammunition produced represented the ability to project power across vaster distances. The legacy of island hopping extended far beyond the Pacific War. American military doctrine was fundamentally transformed by the revelation that logistical capacity could be weaponized. Future American military strategy would be built not on tactical maneuver, but on the projection of supply lines. The ability to maintain military forces at arbitrary distances from the homeland became the defining characteristic of American military power. The concept of power projection the American capacity to apply military force anywhere on the globe, emerged directly from the logistical lessons of the Pacific War. Island hopping proved that geography was irrelevant to military power when logistical capacity was unlimited. Modern warfare, in its essence, is still fighting the ghost of this realization. Contemporary military strategies that emphasize forward operating bases, strategic logistics, and continuous resupply are descendants of the island hopping campaign. The ability to project force across oceanic distances remained the defining advantage of American military power through the Cold War and into the present era. Island hopping was not merely a campaign. It was the birth of modern warfare itself, warfare in which industrial capacity replaces strategy, in which logistics replaces tactics, and in which abundance becomes the ultimate weapon against scarcity.